The morning sun was just starting to peek through the tall buildings when Maya Rodriguez stepped off the old city bus. Her small, weathered hands gripped the handle of a black keyboard case that had seen better days. The case was covered in scratches and worn stickers from music stores that had closed down years ago. She moved slowly but with purpose, her back slightly bent from carrying the weight of both her instrument and her worries. Maya was 67 years old, but she felt much older these days. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a faded blue sweater that her late husband Carlos had bought her for Christmas 5 years ago. It was getting thin at the elbows, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. It still smelled like him sometimes, especially on cold mornings like this one. She walked toward the downtown bus stop where dozens of people would soon gather for their morning commute. This wasn't her usual bus stop. No, Maya lived on the other side of town in a tiny apartment that she could barely afford. But she came here every single day for the past month because this is where the people were. People with jobs, people with money, people who might spare a few coins for an old woman trying to make ends meet. The bus stop was one of those modern glass structures with digital displays showing arrival times. There were 3 long benches inside, and Maya always chose the one closest to the street. Not because it was more comfortable, but because that's where people could see her best. She set down her case and opened it carefully, like she was handling something precious. Inside, nestled in faded foam padding, was her small electric piano. It wasn't much to look at. The black plastic had faded to gray in some spots, and a few of the keys stuck when you pressed them. But it still worked, and more importantly, it still made music. Maya had bought it 10 years ago when the school where she taught couldn't afford a real piano for her classroom. Back then, she had a steady job, health insurance, and enough money to buy groceries without counting every penny. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. Maya plugged a small amplifier into the piano and adjusted the volume. She had learned through trial and error that it needed to be loud enough for people to hear over the traffic noise, but not so loud that it annoyed anyone. The last thing she wanted was for someone to complain and get her kicked out of her spot. She looked around as more people started arriving for their morning buses. Men in expensive suits checking their phones, women in business clothes carrying coffee cups, young people with backpacks heading to college classes. They all looked so busy. So important, so different from her. Maya remembered when she used to be one of them. Not the expensive suits part, but the busy part. She would rush to catch her bus every morning, always running a few minutes late, always stressed about her lesson plans or parent conferences or the dozen other things teachers had to worry about. She had taught music at Roosevelt Elementary for 23 years. 23 years of helping children discover the joy of music, of watching shy kids bloom when they sang their first solo, of seeing troubled students find peace at the piano keys, but budget cuts had ended all of that. The school district decided that music wasn't essential, that reading and math were more important than helping children express themselves through song. Maya understood the reasoning, but it didn't make losing her job any easier. At 66, she was too old for most employers to consider, and too young to collect her full retirement benefits. Her arthritis made her hands hurt most mornings. The joints in her fingers would ache and stiffen, especially when the weather was cold or damp, like today. But she had discovered that playing music actually helped with the pain. Something about the gentle movement and the focus required made her forget about the discomfort. At least for a while, Maya placed her weathered music book on the small stand attached to her piano. The pages were yellow with age and soft from being turned thousands of times. Most of the songs she knew by heart anyway, but having the music there made her feel more professional, more legitimate. She watched as more and more people gathered at the bus stop. Some stood near the edge of the curb, scanning the street for their ride. Others sat on the benches, lost in their phones or newspapers. A few people chatted quietly with friends or coworkers, but most of them seemed to exist in their own little bubbles, focused on getting to work on time and starting another day at jobs that hopefully paid enough to cover their bills. Maya understood that feeling completely. For most of her adult life, she had been focused on the same things: Get up, go to work, teach her classes, come home, grade papers, plan lessons, go to bed, and do it all again the next day. She had loved teaching, but she had rarely thought about the people around her who might be struggling. The homeless man who sometimes slept in the doorway of the music store. The woman who cleaned the school bathrooms and worked 2 other jobs just to support her family. The elderly substitute teacher who took any assignment he could get. Because his pension wasn't enough. Now, Maya was one of those people that others hurried past without really seeing. She took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the familiar keys. The morning rush was about to begin in earnest, and she needed to start playing before everyone became too focused on catching their buses. She had learned that timing was everything in this new career of hers. Too early, and there weren't enough people around. Too late, and everyone was too stressed about being late for work to pay attention to an old woman with a piano. Maya closed her eyes for just a moment and thought about Carlos. He had always encouraged her to share her music with the world, not just with her students. He used to say that she had a gift, and gifts were meant to be given away, not hidden. She wished he could see her now, though she wasn't sure he would approve of the circumstances that had brought her to this bus stop. But he would definitely approve of her courage to keep playing, to keep sharing her music, even when it was scary and uncertain, and her arthritis made her fingers protest. Music had always been her language, her way of connecting with the world and expressing things that words couldn't capture. She opened her eyes and looked at the growing crowd of morning commuters. Soon, one of them would change everything, though. She had no way of knowing that yet. For now, she was just an old woman with a worn-out piano, hoping to earn enough coins to buy groceries and maybe pay the electric bill that was already 2 weeks overdue. Jake Morrison was having what he liked to call a perfect morning. His Italian leather shoes clicked confidently against the sidewalk as he strode toward the bus stop, his phone pressed against his ear. He wore a charcoal gray suit that cost more than most people made in a month, and his watch gleamed gold in the morning sunlight. Everything about Jake screamed success, from his perfectly styled hair to his designer briefcase. He was 28 years old, and worked as an investment banker at one of the city's most prestigious firms. In his world, everything was about numbers, deals, and making money, lots and lots of money. Jake had grown up in the suburbs where his biggest worry was which expensive college to attend. His parents had paid for everything, and now his 6-figure salary kept him living the lifestyle he had always known. Jake was talking loudly into his phone, partly because the call was important, but mostly because he enjoyed having other people hear about his success. He was discussing a deal that would net his company millions, using terms like acquisition and market leverage that made him sound important and smart. "Listen, Brad," he said into his phone, his voice carrying across the bus stop area. "If we close this deal by Friday, we're looking at a 7-figure commission. 7 figures, man. I'm thinking about getting that new car I showed you last week." As Jake approached the bus stop, he noticed something unusual. There was an old woman sitting on one of the benches, and she appeared to be setting up some kind of musical instrument. Jake slowed his pace, curious about what was happening. He had never seen anything like this at his usual bus stop before. Maya was carefully arranging her small electric piano, trying to make sure everything was positioned just right. Her hands moved slowly and deliberately as she adjusted the stand and checked the connections. She was completely focused on her task, unaware that she was being watched. Jake stopped walking and stared. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. An elderly woman with a small keyboard at a bus stop? It was like something out of a movie, except this was real life. His real life. His perfectly organized, successful, important real life that didn't usually include old ladies with musical instruments. "Brad, hold on a second," Jake said into his phone, lowering it slightly so he could get a better look at the situation. "You're not going to believe this. There's some old woman setting up a piano at my bus stop, like an actual piano." Jake walked closer, his curiosity getting the better of him. He had never seen street performers in this part of town before. This was the business district, where serious people with serious jobs caught buses to their serious offices. It wasn't the Kind of place where people played music for money. Maya looked up and noticed Jake watching her. She gave him a small, nervous smile and went back to her preparations. She was used to people staring. Most of them either ignored her completely or looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Very few people actually stopped to listen. To her music. Jake put his phone back to his ear and started talking again, but louder this time. Sorry about that, Brad. Yeah, there's this old lady here with a keyboard. I guess she thinks this is Carnegie Hall or something. He laughed at his own joke, and his voice carried across the bus stop. Other commuters were starting to arrive for their morning buses. There was a young mother with her daughter, both dressed for what looked like a day of shopping or errands. A few college students with heavy backpacks were checking their phones and looking tired. Several office workers in business attire stood near the curb, scanning the street for their rides. Jake noticed that some of these people were also looking at Maya with curiosity. He felt a strange sense of superiority, like he was somehow above this situation, while they were just as confused as the old woman herself. I mean, seriously, Jake continued into his phone, not bothering to lower his voice. What's next? A full orchestra? Maybe a circus? This is supposed to be a bus stop, not a concert hall. The young mother glanced at Jake with a disapproving look, but he didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying his own commentary on the situation. His colleague Brad was laughing on the other end of the phone, encouraging Jake to keep describing the scene. Maya could hear every word Jake was saying. Her cheeks started to turn red with embarrassment, but she tried to ignore him and focus on getting ready to play. She had dealt with rude people before. In her month of playing at bus stops, she had encountered everything from people who yelled at her to move along, to others who made jokes about her age or her appearance, but there was something particularly cruel about Jake's comments. Maybe it was the fact that he was making them so publicly, or maybe it was the dismissive way he talked about her, as if she wasn't even a real person with real feelings. He spoke about her like she was just an obstacle in his path, something amusing to discuss with his friend. You should see this thing she's playing, Jake said, gesturing toward Maya's piano with his free hand. It looks like it came from a garage sale. I'm surprised it even makes sound. Although maybe that's a blessing, you know what I mean? Jake's laughter echoed across the bus stop, and several people turned to look at him. Some seemed annoyed by his loud phone conversation, while others appeared uncomfortable with his obvious mockery of the elderly woman. Maya's hands were shaking slightly as she made her final preparations. She had been nervous before, but Jake's comments were making everything worse. She started to doubt herself. Maybe this was a bad idea. Maybe she should pack up and find a different bus stop, one where people might be more understanding. But then she remembered something Carlos used to tell her when she was nervous about performing for parent nights at school. He would say, music doesn't care what other people think. Music just wants to be heard. She took a deep breath and tried to channel that wisdom. Jake was still talking, still laughing, still making jokes at Maya's expense. He had attracted the attention of a few other young professionals who seemed to find his commentary entertaining. They formed a small group near the edge of the bus stop, occasionally glancing over at Maya and smirking. I wonder what she's going to play, Jake said loudly. Probably something really depressing. You know how these street musician types are? Always trying to make you feel sorry for them. Maya had heard enough. She knew that if she waited any longer, she might lose her nerve completely. Her arthritis was making her fingers stiff, and Jake's cruel comments were making her heart race with anxiety. But she had come here to play music, and that's exactly what she was going to do. She placed her weathered hands on the keys and took one last deep breath. Behind her, Jake was still talking on his phone, still making jokes, still completely unaware that he was about to witness something that would change his perspective forever. Maya's hands hovered just inches above the piano keys, trembling like leaves in a gentle breeze. But this wasn't gentle at all. Her fingers shook from a combination of things that all seemed to hit her at once. The arthritis that made her joints ache every morning was acting up, probably because of the cool, damp weather. Her nerves were frayed from Jake's loud, cruel comments that still echoed in her ears. And underneath it all was something deeper, something that had been growing stronger each day she came to this bus stop. Fear, not fear of playing music. She had been playing piano since she was 7 years old, when her grandmother had taught. Her first song on an old upright piano that had survived 3 generations of her family. She wasn't afraid of making mistakes either. After 23 years of teaching children, she had learned that mistakes were just part of learning, part of growing, part of being human. No, this was a different kind of fear. It was the fear of being seen as pathetic. The fear of confirming what people like Jake already thought about her. The fear that maybe, just maybe, they were right. Maya glanced around the bus stop, trying to gauge the mood of the small crowd that had gathered. The young mother with her daughter was standing near the back of the glass shelter, and Maya could see the woman shooting disapproving looks in Jake's direction. The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, was staring at Maya's piano with the kind of wide-eyed wonder that only children possessed. There were about 15 people waiting now, and more seemed to arrive every few minutes. A group of college students stood huddled together, sharing earbuds and looking like they would rather be anywhere else than waiting for a bus on a Tuesday morning. 2 older men in work clothes sat on the bench across from Maya, sipping coffee from paper cups and checking their phones for the time. Maya noticed that most people were trying very hard not to look directly at her. It was like she had become invisible, or maybe they were trying to make her invisible by pretending she wasn't there. She understood this reaction. She had probably done the same thing herself when she was rushing to work every morning, focused on her own problems and responsibilities, but Jake wasn't trying to ignore her at all. If anything, he seemed to be enjoying the situation more and more. He had finished his phone call with Brad, but now he was talking to 2 other young men in expensive suits who had joined him near the edge of the bus stop. Maya could hear fragments of their conversation, and none of it was kind. "I don't know what she's expecting to happen," one of them said, laughing quietly. "Does she think people are going to throw money at her just because she has a keyboard?" "Maybe she's confused," Jake replied, his voice carrying just enough for Maya to hear. "Maybe she thinks this is some kind of talent show or something." Maya felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. Her hands, which had been hovering over the keys, began to shake even more. She looked down at her fingers and noticed how old they looked. When had the skin become so thin and spotted? When had the knuckles become so swollen from arthritis? These hands had once been strong and sure, capable of playing the most complicated pieces without hesitation. She remembered the first time Carlos had heard her play. It was at a church social 45 years ago, and she had been asked to accompany the choir for a special song. She was nervous then too, but for different reasons. She was nervous because she wanted to impress this handsome man who had been trying to get her attention for weeks. Carlos had stood in the back of the church during her performance, and when the song was over, he had been the first person to clap. Later, he told her that watching her play had been like watching someone speak a language that only angels understood. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. "Your music doesn't just come from your fingers," Carlos used to tell her during the early years of their marriage. "It comes from your heart, and your heart is beautiful." But Carlos wasn't here now. He had been gone for 3 years, taken by a heart attack that came without warning on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Maya had found him in his favorite chair, the newspaper still folded in his lap, looking like he had simply decided to take a nap. Sometimes Maya wondered if Carlos would approve of what she was doing now. He had always encouraged her to share her music, but he had also been proud of her job as a teacher, proud of the stability and respect that came with it. Would he understand why she was sitting at a bus stop with a worn-out piano, hoping strangers would give her enough money to buy groceries? Maya almost started to pack up her piano. The thought crossed her mind so suddenly that her hands actually moved toward the power switch. It would be so easy to just turn everything off, close the case, and walk away. She could catch the next bus home and spend the day in her small apartment, where no one could see her or judge her or make jokes about her. But then she heard something that made her stop. "Mommy, why is that lady sad?" It was the little girl speaking in the loud whisper that children used when they thought they were being quiet. "I don't know, sweetie," her mother replied softly. "Maybe she's just nervous. Is she going to play music?" "I think so." "I like music," the little girl said simply. Maya felt something shift inside her chest. She looked over at the child, who was still staring at the piano with curiosity and excitement. The little girl wasn't judging her or feeling sorry for her. She was just interested in hearing music, the way children always were before the world taught them to be cautious and critical. Maya thought about all the children she had taught over the years. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. She remembered Tommy, who had been so shy he could barely speak above a whisper, until the day he sang a solo in the school concert and discovered he had a beautiful voice. She remembered Lisa, whose parents were going through a difficult divorce, and how playing piano had given her a safe place to express feelings she couldn't put into words. She remembered David, who had a learning disability that made reading and math extremely difficult, but who could pick up any song by ear after hearing it just once. The day David played his first complete piece for the class, every single student had cheered and applauded like he had just won the Olympics. Music had always been about connection for Maya. It was about reaching across the space between people and touching something deeper than words could reach. It was about sharing joy and comfort and hope, especially with people who needed it most. Maya looked at her hands again, and this time she didn't see old, arthritic fingers. She saw the same hands that had helped countless children discover the magic of music. She saw the hands that Carlos had kissed every night before they went to sleep. She saw hands that still had music in them. Regardless of what Jake or anyone else thought, the arthritis pain was still there, and her nerves were still jumping, but Maya felt something else rising up inside her. It was the same feeling she used to get right before a school concert, when she knew that despite all the rehearsals and preparation, anything could happen once the curtain went up. It was excitement mixed with fear, hope mixed with uncertainty. It was the feeling of being fully alive. Maya took a deep breath and gently placed her fingers on the piano keys. They felt cool and familiar, like old friends welcoming her home. The first note came out softer than Maya had intended. Her finger pressed the key gently, almost hesitantly, and the sound that emerged from her small electric piano was barely audible above the morning traffic, but it was there. After all the doubt and fear and trembling, the music had finally begun. Maya pressed another key, then another. The melody that flowed from her fingers was one she had written herself many years ago, back when Carlos was still alive and she still had her teaching job. She had called it Morning Hope, and she had composed it during a particularly difficult time in their marriage. When money was tight and Carlos had been laid off from his job at the factory, the song had come to her one morning when she was sitting at their old piano, trying to find a way to express the mixture of worry and optimism she felt every day. It wasn't a complicated piece, but it was deeply personal. Every note carried a memory. Every chord progression told a story of struggle and perseverance and the quiet faith that tomorrow might be better than today. As Maya's fingers found their rhythm, the arthritis pain seemed to fade into the background. This was always how it happened when she played music that truly mattered to her. The physical discomfort became secondary to the emotional release that music provided. Her hands, which had been shaking just moments before, began to move with increasing confidence across the keys. The melody started low and gentle, like a conversation between old friends who hadn't seen each other in a long time. Each note seemed to ask a question, and the next note provided a thoughtful answer. Maya had always believed that good music was like a story that didn't need words. It could express things that regular language couldn't touch, feelings that were too complex or too deep for ordinary conversation. Behind her, Jake was still talking on his phone, but now he was speaking even louder than before. It was as if he had made a deliberate decision to compete with Maya's music, to drown out her gentle melody with his aggressive business talk. No, Brad," Jake said, his voice cutting through the morning air. "We need to close this deal by end of business today. I don't care what their lawyers say about the contract terms. We have the leverage here and we need to use it. Maya could hear every word, but she tried to let the music create a buffer between herself and Jake's harsh energy. She focused on the story her song was telling, the way the melody moved from uncertainty to hope, from fear to faith. The young mother with her daughter was the first person to really notice. She had been checking her phone for the bus schedule when the music reached her ears. Something about the gentle, haunting quality of the melody made her look up from her screen. She watched Maya's hands moving across the keys and found herself drawn into the story the music was telling. "Mommy, listen," the little girl whispered, tugging on her mother's coat. "The music is pretty." The mother nodded, surprised by how beautiful the simple melody sounded. She had expected something amateurish or desperate, the kind of performance that made you feel sorry for the person playing. But this was different. This was real music, played by someone who clearly understood how to make a piano sing, one of the college students noticed next. He had been sharing earbuds with his girlfriend, listening to whatever was popular on the streaming apps. When he became aware of live music happening just a few feet away, he pulled out one of his earbuds and nudged his girlfriend to do the same. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. She listened for a moment, then smiled. "That's really good," she said quietly, "like really good." Maya continued playing, letting the melody develop and grow. The song was telling the story of a morning when everything seemed impossible, when the bills were piling up and the future looked uncertain. But then the sun came up, as it always did, and with the light came the possibility that things could change. That hope was still alive even when everything else seemed lost. The two older men in work clothes had stopped their quiet conversation and were listening now too. One of them, a man with calloused hands and paint under his fingernails, recognized something in Maya's music that reminded him of his own struggles. He had been laid off twice in the past 5 years, and he knew what it felt like to wonder how you were going to pay the rent or buy groceries. "She's good," he said to his friend, nodding toward Maya. "Yeah, she is," his friend agreed. "Real good." Maya could sense that people were starting to pay attention, but she didn't dare look up from the keys. She was afraid that if she broke her concentration, she might lose the confidence that was building with each note. Instead, she let herself get lost in the music, the way she used to when she was a young woman playing for her own pleasure rather than for anyone else's approval. The melody reached a point where it seemed to hang in the air for a moment, like a question waiting for an answer. Maya's fingers paused on the keys, and in that brief silence, even Jake's voice seemed to fade into the background. Then she pressed down on a chord that resolved the tension, bringing the musical conversation back to a place of peace and acceptance. Jake was still talking, still trying to dominate the acoustic space around the bus stop, but his voice was starting to sound harsh and ugly compared to the gentle beauty of Maya's music. A few people near him were beginning to look annoyed, not just with his rudeness toward Maya, but with the way his aggressive tone was interfering with something lovely. "I'm telling you, Brad, these people don't understand how business works," Jake said, waving his free hand for emphasis. "They think they can just waste our time with endless negotiations. Well, I've got news for them." But even as Jake spoke, something was happening that he wasn't aware of. The atmosphere around the bus stop was changing. People who had been focused on their phones or their newspapers or their own internal conversations were beginning to tune into Maya's music. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in attention, but it was real. Maya's song continued to unfold, telling its story of struggle and hope. The melody moved through different emotional territories, sometimes sad, sometimes wistful, sometimes touched with a quiet joy that came from small moments of beauty in an otherwise difficult world. It was the kind of music that made you think about your own life, your own struggles, your own reasons for getting up each morning and trying again. The little girl had moved closer to Maya, drawn by curiosity and wonder. Her mother followed, keeping a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder, but she was listening just as intently as the child. There was something about Maya's playing that made the ordinary bus stop feel like a different kind of place, somewhere special where beautiful things could happen unexpectedly. One of the college students pulled out his phone, not to ignore the music, but to record it. He held the device discreetly, not wanting to disturb Maya or make her self-conscious, but feeling like this was a moment worth capturing. Maya's fingers danced across the keys with increasing fluidity. The years of teaching children had trained her to play with expression and emotion, to make every note count. She wasn't just playing the melody, she was inhabiting it, living inside the story it told. This was what she had always loved most about music, the way it could transport both the performer and the listener to a place beyond ordinary experience. The song was building toward its climax now, the place where hope finally emerged victorious over doubt. Maya's hands moved with surprising strength and agility, the arthritis temporarily forgotten in the joy of making music that mattered. She could feel the attention of the growing crowd, but instead of making her nervous, their interest gave her energy and confidence. Behind her, Jake was still talking, but his voice was beginning to sound like background noise compared to the increasingly powerful music flowing from Maya's piano. Something magical was happening to Maya's hands. As she continued playing Morning Hope, the stiffness and pain that usually plagued her arthritic fingers began to melt away, replaced by a fluid grace she hadn't felt in years. It was as if the music itself was healing her, reminding her body of what it used to be capable of when passion overrode physical limitations. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It started slowly, note by note, as Maya allowed herself to sink deeper into the emotional landscape of her composition. The melody she had written during those difficult times with Carlos was coming alive under her fingers in a way it never had before. Every chord progression seemed to unlock another layer of feeling, another memory, another reason to keep playing despite everything that had brought her to this moment. Maya's posture began to change as the music took hold of her. Her shoulders, which had been hunched with nervousness and embarrassment, straightened as confidence flowed back into her body. Her back, usually curved from years of carrying worry and stress, found its natural alignment. She was no longer a desperate old woman hoping for spare change. She was a musician, pure and simple, doing what she was born to do. The small electric piano, which had seemed so inadequate just minutes before, began to reveal its hidden potential under Maya's increasingly skilled touch. She knew exactly how to coax warmth and richness from its simple electronics, how to make each note sing with the kind of expression that came only from decades of musical experience. The instrument wasn't the problem. It never had been. All it needed was someone who understood how to make it speak. As Maya transitioned from Morning Hope into an improvised variation that flowed naturally from the original melody, something extraordinary began to happen in the space around the bus. Stop. The music was creating an invisible sphere of beauty that seemed to expand outward with each passing moment, touching everyone within its reach and drawing them into its story. The young mother found herself moving closer, almost without realizing it. She had started out standing near the back of the bus shelter, but the pull of Maya's music was irresistible. Her daughter, still wide-eyed with wonder, had already crept forward until she was standing just a few feet from the piano bench, completely captivated by the sight of Maya's fingers dancing across the keys. "How does she make it sound like that?" the little girl whispered to her mother. "I don't know, sweetie," her mother replied, but she was asking herself the same question. The music coming from that modest electric piano sounded richer and more emotionally complex than anything she had heard in a concert hall. There was something raw and honest about it that made her chest feel tight with emotion. The two college students had completely abandoned their conversation about weekend plans and upcoming exams. They stood shoulder to shoulder, sharing an experience that neither of them would forget. The young man who had started recording on his phone lowered the device, realizing that this moment was too precious to view through a screen. Some things needed to be experienced directly, without any barriers between the heart and the music. "This is incredible," his girlfriend murmured, and he nodded in agreement. Not trusting his voice to speak, Maya's improvisation was becoming more complex now, incorporating jazz elements that she had learned during her college years but hadn't played in decades. Her left hand found a walking bass line that provided a steady foundation for the soaring melody her right hand was weaving. The combination created a rich, full sound that seemed impossible to achieve with just two hands and a simple electronic keyboard. The two older men in work clothes had stopped pretending to check their phones. They sat on their bench, coffee cups forgotten, completely absorbed in Maya's performance. One of them, a man named Frank who had worked construction for 35 years, felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. The music was speaking to something deep inside him, something that had been buried under years of hard work and small disappointments. "My wife used to play piano," Frank said quietly to his friend. "Used to?" his friend asked. "Before the arthritis. Got too bad. She had to stop a few years ago. Said her hands just wouldn't cooperate anymore." Frank looked at Maya's hands, moving with such grace and precision despite her obvious age, and felt a spark of hope. Maybe his wife didn't have to give up music completely. Maybe there was still a way for her to find her way back to the piano. Bench. More people were arriving at the bus stop now, drawn not just by their morning commutes, but by the sound of live music drifting down the street. A businessman hurrying to catch his usual bus slowed his pace as Maya's melody reached his ears. A woman walking her dog stopped on the sidewalk, allowing her pet to sniff around while she listened to the unexpected concert. Maya was completely lost in the music now. Her consciousness merged with the flow of notes and chords in a way that made everything else fade into the background. This was the state she had always sought when she played, the place where technique and emotion became one, where the boundary between the musician and the music dissolved completely. Her improvisation was telling a new story now, one that moved beyond the original Morning Hope into something entirely different. It was a story of resilience and rediscovery, of finding beauty in unexpected places, of the courage it took to be vulnerable in front of strangers. Each phrase built on the last, creating a musical narrative that seemed to speak directly to everyone listening. Jake was still talking on his phone, but his voice had taken on a different quality. He was no longer shouting to compete with Maya's music. Instead, he seemed to be fighting against it, struggling to maintain his aggressive tone in the face of something so genuinely beautiful. His business conversation felt increasingly hollow and meaningless compared to the emotional depth of Maya's performance. "Look, Brad, I need to call you back," Jake found himself saying, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Something about the music was making it difficult for him to concentrate on acquisitions and profit margins. "There's something happening here that I need to. I'll call you later." Jake ended the call and slipped his phone into his pocket, but he didn't move closer to Maya's piano like the others. Instead, he stood frozen in place, caught between his instinct to mock what he didn't understand and a growing awareness that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Maya's hands were flying across the keys now with a speed and dexterity that seemed to defy her age and physical condition. The music had unlocked something in her muscle memory, awakening skills that had been dormant but never truly lost. She was playing not just with her fingers but with her entire body, swaying slightly with the rhythm, her face glowing with an inner light that made her look decades younger. The improvisation reached a crescendo that seemed to lift everyone listening up with it. Maya's right hand found a melody line that soared above the complex harmonies her left hand was providing, creating a moment of pure musical transcendence that made several people in the growing crowd gasp audibly. An elderly woman with a walking cane had joined the group of listeners, tears streaming down her cheeks as Maya's music awakened memories of her own youth, when she had dreamed of being a pianist before life led her in other directions. A teenage boy with earbuds around his neck stood transfixed, hearing acoustic music performed live for the first time in his life and discovering that it was completely different from anything that came through speakers. Maya's transformation was complete now. She was no longer the nervous, embarrassed woman who had hesitated at the keys just minutes before. She was a master musician sharing her gift with the world, creating a moment of beauty and connection in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday morning. Her arthritis was forgotten, her financial worries temporarily set aside, her embarrassment replaced by the pure joy of making music that mattered. The bus stop had become something else entirely, transformed by Maya's playing into a concert hall, where strangers became an audience united by their shared experience of witnessing something truly special. Word travels fast in the city, especially when something unexpected and beautiful happens in the middle of an ordinary morning. It started with the woman walking her dog, who had stopped on the sidewalk to listen to Maya's music. She pulled out her phone, not to record, but to text her friend who worked in the office building across the street. "Come down to the bus stop on 5th Street, she typed quickly. "There's this amazing woman playing piano and you have to hear this." Within minutes, her friend appeared at the entrance of the office building, curious about what could be so special that it warranted interrupting her morning routine. The moment she heard Maya's music floating through the air, she understood completely. She walked closer, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had captured everyone else, a delivery driver making his rounds heard the music through his open truck window and found himself slowing down, then pulling over to the curb. He had been delivering packages in this neighborhood for 5 years and had never heard anything like this. The music made him think of his grandmother, who used to play accordion at family gatherings when he was a child. He left his truck and joined the growing crowd. His delivery schedule temporarily forgotten, Maya was deep into a new musical journey now, having moved beyond her original composition into something that felt like it was being created in real time. Her fingers seemed to know exactly where to go next, as if the music itself was guiding her hands. She had discovered a rhythm that felt both familiar and completely new, a groove that made even the most hurried commuters slow their pace as they passed by. The crowd around the bus stop had doubled in size since Maya first started playing. What had begun as a handful of morning commuters waiting for their rides had grown into a genuine audience of more than 20 people, with more arriving every few minutes. They came from all directions and all walks of life, united by their shared amazement at what they were witnessing. An elderly man with a cane made his way slowly toward the bus stop, guided by the sound of piano music that reminded him of jazz clubs he used to frequent in his younger days. He found a spot near the back of the crowd and leaned on his cane, a smile spreading across his weathered face as Maya's improvisation moved through chord progressions that he recognized from the masters he had listened to decades ago. Two teenage girls who had been walking to school stopped dead in their tracks when they heard the music. They were used to everything being produced digitally, auto-tuned, and perfectly engineered. But this was raw and real and alive in a way that their usual music wasn't. They looked at each other with wide eyes, neither wanting to admit how much they were enjoying something so different from what they normally listened to. "This is actually really cool," one of them whispered to her friend. "Yeah, like really cool," her friend agreed. And they both moved closer to get a better view of Maya's hands dancing across the keys. A businessman who had been rushing to an important meeting found himself walking slower and slower as Maya's music reached his ears. He checked his watch and realized he was going to be late, but somehow it didn't seem to matter as much as it usually did. There was something about the music that put his daily stress into perspective, that reminded him of why he had originally chosen his career before it became all about deadlines and bottom lines. He pulled out his phone to call his assistant and reschedule his morning appointments. "Something came up," he said into the phone, which was true. Even if it wasn't the kind of emergency his colleagues would understand, the young mother with her daughter had moved to the front of the crowd now, with the little girl sitting cross-legged on the ground just a few feet from Maya's piano bench. The child was completely mesmerized, watching Maya's fingers with the kind of intense focus that children brought to things that truly captured their imagination. "Mommy, how does she make all those different sounds at the same time?" the little girl asked in a whisper. "It's like she's having a conversation with herself," her mother replied, surprised by her own poetic response. "One hand is asking questions and the other hand is giving answers." The little girl nodded as if this made perfect sense, which somehow it did. Maya's playing had evolved into something that defied easy categorization. She was blending classical technique with jazz harmonies, adding touches of blues and even some Latin rhythms that spoke to her Mexican heritage. It was as if decades of musical knowledge and experience were flowing out of her all at once, creating something that was uniquely hers yet spoke to universal human experiences. Several people in the crowd had pulled out their phones to record the performance, but most of them found themselves lowering their devices after a few seconds. There was something about Maya's music that demanded to be experienced directly, without the barrier of a screen. It was too immediate, too emotionally complex to be captured properly by a camera. One young man, a music student from the nearby college, was recording audio on his phone while taking careful notes about the chord progressions Maya was using. He had been studying jazz piano for 3 years and thought he understood improvisation, but Maya was doing things with harmony and rhythm that he had never heard before. This wasn't just a performance. It was a master class happening right in front of him. A group of construction workers on their coffee break had wandered over from a job site 2 blocks away, drawn by the sound of live music. They stood at the edge of the crowd, still wearing their hard hats and tool belts, looking slightly out of place but completely absorbed in Maya's performance. One of them, a man who played guitar in a weekend band, was nodding his head in time with Maya's rhythm, understanding on a deep level the skill and musicianship he was witnessing. "That lady's got some serious chops," he said to his coworker. "What's chops?" his friend asked. "Skills, man, real skills. You don't just pick that up overnight." Jake was still standing where he had been when Maya first started playing, but everything about his posture and expression had changed. The phone call that had seemed so important 30 minutes ago now felt like a distant memory. His expensive briefcase hung forgotten at his side, and his usually perfect hair was slightly mussed from running his hands through it in confusion and disbelief. Jake had grown up in a world where value was measured in dollars and success was quantified by quarterly earnings reports. He had been taught that anything that didn't contribute directly to profit margins was essentially worthless. Art, music, poetry, these were luxuries for people who had already made their money and could afford to waste time on frivolous pursuits. But Maya's music was forcing him to confront the possibility that he had been wrong about everything. There was something happening at this bus stop that couldn't be measured in spreadsheets or captured in PowerPoint presentations. It was real in a way that his business deals weren't, valuable in a way that his commission checks couldn't touch. Maya herself seemed to glow with an inner light as she played. The worried, embarrassed woman who had hesitantly approached the piano keys was completely gone, replaced by an artist who had remembered why she fell in love with music in the first place. Her eyes were closed now, her face tilted slightly upward as if she was receiving the melody from somewhere beyond the ordinary world. The music was building toward something magnificent, a climax that everyone in the crowd could sense approaching, even if they couldn't predict exactly what form it would take. Maya's hands were moving with increasing speed and complexity, weaving musical patterns that seemed to pull everyone listening deeper into the story she was telling. An office worker who had been on her way to a job she hated found tears streaming down her cheeks as Maya's music reminded her of dreams she had abandoned years ago. A taxi driver had pulled over and was leaning against his car, remembering the lullabies his mother used to sing when he was small. A street vendor had left his cart to join the crowd, moved by music that spoke to his own immigrant experience of building a new life in a strange land. The bus stop had become something magical, a place where strangers had become an audience and an audience had become a community, all connected by their shared experience of witnessing something extraordinary happening in the most ordinary of places. Maya could feel it building inside her like a wave gathering strength before it crashes against the shore. The music was reaching toward something bigger than anything she had played in years, maybe even bigger than anything she had ever played. Her fingers moved across the keys with a confidence that surprised even her, as if they remembered skills she thought arthritis had stolen forever. The crowd around the bus stop had grown to nearly 40 people now, and more were still arriving. Someone had started a video that was already being shared on social media, spreading the word about the incredible performance happening at an ordinary bus stop. But even those watching through their phones found themselves drawn into the real-time experience, lowering their devices to witness Maya's music with their own eyes and ears. Maya was building toward her finale now, and everyone could sense it. even if they couldn't name exactly what was happening. There was something in the way her shoulders squared, the way her breathing deepened, the way her whole body seemed to prepare for one final musical statement that would capture everything she had been trying to say. The melody she had been weaving for the past 20 minutes was about to transform into something magnificent. Maya's left hand found a deep, rolling bass line that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. It was rich and powerful, providing a foundation that made her small electric piano sound like a full orchestra. Over this foundation, her right hand began to spin a melody that soared higher and higher, each note building on the last like steps leading toward heaven. The little girl sitting near Maya's feet looked up at her mother with wonder. "Mommy, it's like she's flying," she whispered, and somehow that simple observation captured exactly what everyone was feeling. Maya did look like she was flying, her spirit lifted by the music flowing through her hands. Jake had moved closer without realizing it. The man who had mocked Maya just 30 minutes ago was now standing in the middle of the crowd, his expensive suit wrinkled from standing in one place for so long, his briefcase forgotten at his feet. His mouth was slightly open as he watched Maya's hands dance across the keys with a skill that challenged everything he thought he knew about value and worth. Maya's music was telling a story that everyone could understand, even if they couldn't put it into words. It was the story of every person who had ever struggled and found the strength to keep going. It was about the beauty that could emerge from pain, the hope that could grow from disappointment, the way ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they stopped being afraid of what others might think. An elderly woman in the crowd was crying openly now, not from sadness but from a joy so deep it overflowed through her tears. She had been a music teacher herself 40 years ago, and she recognized the rare gift she was witnessing. Maya wasn't just playing notes on a keyboard. She was channeling something pure and true that connected every person listening to their own deepest experiences of beauty and meaning. The music reached a moment of perfect suspension, where every note hung in the air like stars that might fall at any second. Maya's hands paused for just a heartbeat, and in that silence the entire crowd held its breath. Even the traffic noise seemed to fade away, as if the whole city was listening to what would come next. Then Maya's fingers came down on the keys with a power that surprised everyone, including herself. The sound that emerged from her small piano was enormous, filling not just the bus stop but the entire street with music that seemed to pour directly from her soul. Her right hand found a melody that climbed higher and higher, while her left hand provided harmony so rich and complex that several musicians in the crowd shook their heads in amazement. This was what Maya had been building toward since the first tentative note. This was her statement to the world that she was still here, still valuable, still capable of creating beauty that mattered. Every year of musical training, every student she had taught, every song she had played with Carlos, every moment of doubt and struggle, it was all flowing out of her now in a torrent of music that no one would ever forget. Businessman who had been rushing to an important meeting found himself with tears in his eyes, thinking about his own mother who had given up her dreams to raise her children. A college student who had been questioning whether to continue with her music degree felt her passion reignite as she watched Maya pour her heart into every note. A construction worker remembered the piano lessons his parents couldn't afford to continue and wondered if it was too late to start again. Maya's performance was doing something that went beyond entertainment. It was reminding everyone watching that there was more to life than just getting through each day, that beauty and meaning were possible even in the most unexpected places. Her music was proof that dreams didn't have to die just because life got difficult, that talent didn't disappear just because the world stopped paying attention. The teenager who had been walking to school pulled out her phone, but not to record. She called her grandmother, the one who had always encouraged her to keep practicing violin, even though her friends thought it was boring. "Grandma," she said when the call connected, "I want to come play music with you tonight. I want to learn that song you've been trying to teach me." Jake was experiencing something he had never felt before in his 28 years of life. The music was cracking open something inside his chest, something he didn't even know existed. He thought about his own grandmother, who had died when he was 12, and how she used to hum while she cooked dinner for the family. He hadn't thought about her in years, but Maya's music brought back the memory of feeling completely safe and loved in his grandmother's kitchen. Maya's finale was reaching its peak now, her hands moving with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone her age. The music was complex and layered, with melodies weaving in and out of each other like conversations between old friends. But underneath all the technical skill was something even more impressive, pure emotion, raw and honest and impossible to fake. The crowd was completely silent except for the occasional gasp of amazement as Maya pulled off particularly difficult passages. People were leaning forward, hanging on every note, afraid to miss even a second of what they were witnessing. Some were recording, but most had put their phones away, understanding instinctively that this was something that needed to be experienced fully, without any barriers. Maya's face was glowing with an inner light that made her look decades younger. This was what she had been born to do, what she had trained her whole life to accomplish. Not the playing at bus stops for spare change, but the sharing of music that touched people's hearts and reminded them of what was truly important in life. The music built to a crescendo that seemed to lift everyone listening right off the ground. Maya's fingers found chords that resonated not just in the air but in the chest cavity of every person present. It was the kind of music that made you believe in magic, that reminded you there was still beauty and wonder in the world, despite all the reasons to be cynical. Then, just when it seemed like the music couldn't possibly get any more powerful, Maya began to bring it home. Her finale was approaching, and everyone could sense that they were about to witness something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Maya brought her hands down on the final chord with a gentleness that somehow contained all the power and emotion of everything that had come before. The last notes hung in the morning air like a prayer, slowly fading until there was nothing left but the distant hum of traffic and the sound of 40 people breathing together in perfect silence. For a moment, nobody moved. The crowd stood frozen, as if they were afraid that any sound or motion might break the spell that Maya had woven around them. Even the little girl who had been sitting at Maya's feet remained completely still, her eyes wide with the kind of wonder that adults spend their whole lives trying to recapture. Then, like a dam breaking, the applause began. It started with the elderly woman who had been crying throughout Maya's performance. Her weathered hands came together in slow, deliberate claps that seemed to acknowledge not just the music she had heard, but the lifetime of struggle and beauty that had created it. Others joined in quickly, and within seconds the entire crowd was applauding with an enthusiasm that could be heard blocks away. Maya lifted her hands from the piano keys and looked up for the first time since she had begun playing. The sight that greeted her was almost overwhelming. Dozens of faces looked back at her, all smiling, many with tears in their eyes, all united in their appreciation for what she had just shared with them. "Bravo!" called out the music student, who had been taking notes. "That was incredible." "More, more!" shouted one of the construction workers, and others picked up the chant until Maya felt her cheeks burning with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. The applause continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. Maya had never experienced anything like it, not even during her most successful school concerts. This was different. This was a crowd of strangers who owed her nothing, who had no reason to be kind or encouraging, and yet they were celebrating her music as if it had changed their lives. Maybe it had. As the applause began to die down, people started moving closer to Maya's piano bench. The young mother approached first, her daughter's hand firmly in her own. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "My daughter wants to know if you give piano lessons." Maya looked down at the little girl, who was practically bouncing with excitement. "Would you like to learn to play?" Maya asked gently. Yes, I want to make music like that," the child replied, and Maya felt her heart skip a beat. It had been months since anyone had asked about piano lessons. "I would love to teach you," Maya said, and she meant it more than anything she had said in years. Behind the mother and daughter, A line was forming of people who wanted to speak with Maya. The elderly man with the cane stepped forward next, moving slowly but with determination. "Young lady," he said, and Maya almost laughed at being called young at 67. "I run a small cafe about 6 blocks from here. We've been looking for someone to play background music on weekends. Would you be interested?" Maya stared at him, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. Do you want me to play at your cafe? After what I just heard, lady, I'd be honored to have you play at my place. The pay isn't much, but it's steady work, and you'd have a real audience who appreciates good music." Before Maya could respond, another voice spoke up. It was a middle-aged woman in a business suit who had been standing near the back of the crowd. "Excuse me," the woman said, stepping forward. "I'm the director of the Community Arts Center downtown. We've been looking for someone to teach adult piano classes. Based on what I just witnessed, I think you might be exactly what we need." Maya felt dizzy. 2 job offers in the space of 30 seconds, after months of struggling to make ends meet. She looked around at the crowd of faces, all smiling at her, all treating her like she was someone important, someone valuable. Then she noticed Jake, the young banker, was standing at the edge of the crowd, no longer the confident, mocking figure he had been when Maya first arrived at the bus stop. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was messy, and his face showed a mixture of shame and wonder that made him look much younger than his 28 years. Jake caught Maya's eye and began walking toward her, moving through the crowd with obvious reluctance. When he reached her piano bench, he stood there for a moment, opening and closing his mouth like he couldn't find the right words. He started, then stopped. He tried again. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. What I said earlier? How I acted ... It was wrong, really wrong." Maya studied his face and saw something she hadn't expected. Real remorse, real recognition of what he had done. "You have a gift," Jake continued, his voice getting stronger. "What you just did, that music ... I've never heard anything like it. I was an idiot to make fun of you, and I'm sorry. Really, truly sorry." Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. Maya expected him to drop a few dollars into her piano case like some of the other listeners had done. Instead, he pulled out what looked like several $100 bills. "This isn't charity," he said quickly, seeing Maya's surprised expression. "This is payment for the most incredible concert I've ever attended. You earned this, every penny of it." Maya accepted the money with trembling hands, not because of the amount, though it was more than she usually made in a month, but because of what it represented. Jake's transformation from a cruel mocker to a genuine admirer was, perhaps, the most remarkable thing that had happened on this remarkable morning. "Thank you," Maya said simply, but the words carried weight that Jake seemed to understand. As Jake stepped back, other people continued to approach Maya. The construction worker who played guitar asked if she'd be interested in jamming with his weekend band. A teacher from the nearby elementary school wanted to know if Maya would consider doing a special performance for the children. The teenager who had called her grandmother handed Maya a piece of paper with her phone number, asking if she could arrange some lessons for both herself and her grandmother. Throughout all of this, people continued to drop money into Maya's piano case, not just coins or single bills, but real money. 20s, 50s, even a few hundreds. By the time the crowd began to thin out, Maya's case contained more money than she had seen in one place since losing her teaching job, but more important than the money were the connections being made. Phone numbers were exchanged, business cards were handed over, plans were being discussed. Maya, who had felt invisible and forgotten just an hour earlier, was suddenly the center of a network of people who valued her talent and wanted to help her succeed. The young mother with her daughter was the last to leave after arranging for piano lessons to begin the following week. As they walked away, the little girl turned back and waved at Maya with the enthusiastic energy that only children possessed. "Thank you for the beautiful music," she called out, and Maya felt tears spring to her eyes once again. Finally, the crowd dispersed, leaving Maya alone at the bus stop with her piano and a case full of money and business cards and phone numbers. She sat there for a moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. Her bus arrived, the same one she had been trying to catch when this incredible morning began. But Maya didn't get on. She wasn't the same person who had stepped off that bus an hour ago. That woman had been desperate and afraid, playing music as a last resort to survive another day. This woman, the woman sitting at the piano bench surrounded by evidence of her success, was a musician again. She had work lined up, students to teach, performances to give. She had hope. Maya carefully packed up her piano, handling it with even more care than usual. This instrument, which had seemed so inadequate when she first set it up, had just changed her life. As she closed the case, she whispered a quiet thank you to Carlos, knowing somehow that he had been with her throughout her performance. Walking away from the bus stop, Maya felt lighter than she had in years. Not just because of the money in her case or the job offers in her pocket, but because she had remembered who she really was. She was Maya Rodriguez, music teacher, composer, performer. She was someone whose art could move people to tears, could transform an ordinary bus stop into a concert hall, could remind everyone who heard it that beauty still existed in the world. The morning sun was shining brighter now, and Maya had places to go, people to call, lessons to plan. Her new life was just beginning.